Tonight, the death toll from that new virus has jumped to more than 700. Nearly all were in China. Hundreds more Americans are out of the outbreak zone and under quarantine tonight.
It's very easy to be the clickbait doommonger. It's also very simple to just make light of this, to blow it off. You know, more people are killed by choking on peanuts than the coronavirus.
So in America, you get nothing but clickbait headlines about the coronavirus that inflict fear and stress onto you, which is questionably worse for your health than if you were actually infected with the virus.
So what's the truth here? Deadly killer or overhyped BS? Well, let's take a look at some numbers. But before we do that, let's take a look at it from the virus's perspective. Viruses are not alive in any traditional sense of the word. They self-replicate, but they can't do it without a living organism to use as part of their reproduction. And the reason for that sort of becomes obvious when you just see the length scale of these things. Viruses are about 100 times smaller than bacteria, which in turn is small compared to your typical animal cell. They're getting on for 1,000th of the size of an animal cell. So I've heard them sort of rather poetically described as sort of rogue, vampiric, self-replicating cell parts. In fact, it's one of the things that I've always found fascinating about life on Earth, is this love-hate relationship is probably billions of years old. That is, there have been viruses and cells around for a long time, without the cellular life working out how to make themselves immune to viruses, or the viruses killing all of the cellular life. And these numbers put it all into perspective. Microorganisms constitute about 90% of the biomass in the sea. It is estimated that viruses kill approximately 20% of this biomass each day, and that there are 15 times as many viruses in the ocean as there are bacteria. Now, of course, you've got to bear in mind that viruses are a lot smaller than bacteria. I mean, there's a similar dynamic that goes on between single-celled life, things like bacteria, and multicellular life. Now, you'd have thought at some point in the last 500 million years, which is roughly how long we've had multicellular life on the planet, that either the multicellular life would have outcompeted the single-cellular life or vice versa. But nope, it seems that both of these have their little robust niches on this planet. The little ones can replicate faster, but the bigger ones have survivability in other senses, although this comes at the cost of replication speed. Now, it's entirely conceivable that one of the reasons this relationship hasn't ended between viruses and life is it's in some senses beneficial for both, as a sort of gene transport mechanism. Now, I want to stress, this is beneficial for the species, not for the individual. Viruses kill a lot of people. But in some cases, like say for instance the retroviruses, the way the virus reproduces itself is it gets inside your cell, it sticks its own DNA into your cell, and then it uses your cell's self-replicating components to make more viruses. However, sometimes that viral insertion it doesn't go quite well, and it becomes inactive. It doesn't make any more viruses. And if that happens in a gamete, you now have inactive viral DNA passed on to your offspring, which can be commandeered via evolutionary mechanisms in later generations. Now, this misinsertion of retroviral DNA happens rarely, but still, over the generations, you now have something like a few % of your genome, which is a colossal amount, if you think about it, is actually made up of retroviral DNA. Now, those viruses killed a lot of people in their time, and now they're part of the human genome. Now, it's got to be said that viruses are dumber than idiots. They have no plan. They're just rogue, self-replicating body parts. They're not doing this for fame. They're not doing this because they want people to remember their names in future generations. So, how do you actually define what a successful virus is? Well, almost by definition, it's one that spreads its DNA far and wide in the gene pool. Now, the thing here is if the people you infect end up dying, this limits how far your viral DNA can go. It's just one of those things. Antisocial viruses like this that kill too many of their hosts tend to burn themselves out. And likewise, if you're not infective enough as a virus, you end up just vanishing from the gene pool. there's a balance to be had here. Now, for humans, we have a slightly different perspective on this. We judge viruses solely on how many people they kill. Nasty viruses are the ones that kill people. So how does this relate to the coronavirus?
Aurak, have you been listening to all this?
With interest.
What do you think?
I think you're quite right. A degree of apprehension is not inappropriate.
Look, this is the problem. It's mostly a crapshoot in that it could end up killing tens of millions of people. It could end up killing just a few thousand. And I'll show you why in the maths in a second. It all comes down to one word. Viral. Yeah, just like with viral videos, it's incredibly difficult to predict what will make something go viral. I'll just give you an example from my YouTube days. Pretty much my second most popular video is one that I just made more or less off the cuff. There was no great planning like goes into a lot of these videos. I gave it very little thought. I was doing some work on some potassium-41 and I went through some numbers and worked out it cost about $70 million per kilogram. So I thought, whatever, I'll do a quick video on it and explain why I'm using it. And it did okay when it was put out, and then a few months later, seemingly randomly, it went viral and picked up a few million hits in a few months. Now, there was no plan to this, none whatsoever. I mean, kind of obviously so. If it was so easy and formulaic to make viral videos, why would people bother making anything but viral videos? But on the flip side, it's not entirely random either. I mean, for those who like the philosophical musings, every avalanche starts with a single rolling pebble. But not every single rolling pebble means you have to prepare for an avalanche, which is just a fancy way of saying it's difficult to predict. So how do you know if the coronavirus is going to be more like the Spanish flu pandemic of 1918, which infected about 1/3 of the world's population and killed some 50 million people? That's more people than died in World War I. Or whether it's just going to be a flash in the pan, few thousand people die, and that's it, done. Well, let's take a quick look at some metrics. The entire of virality, whether you're talking videos or coronavirus, works on exactly the same principle, that everyone who either watches your video passes it on to someone else who also watches the video, or you pass the virus on to someone else who also passes it on. So let's put this on a spreadsheet. Good. So here I have the days of the infection. So I'm just going to model this for 60 days, about 2 months-ish. And for each day, I'm going to have a probability of spreading virus. So everyone who is infected is going to have this probability of spreading the virus. And in the first case, I'm just going to set it to 0%. 100% non-transmissible. Okay, so, and that's going to be all the way down. And so this is going to be the number of infected. And I'm going to give it 1 person infected on day 1. So on day 2, we're going to have the original person who was infected, plus each person who is infected has a 0% chance of transmitting the virus. So, number of people infected on day 2 is also 1, and I'm going to put that all the way down to 2 months, and no one else is ever infected because there is a 0% chance of infection. And at this point, let's put up a chart. Cool. So that's now what the number of infected looks like. And there's never anyone infected because there's a 0% chance of spreading the virus. So now let's change this such that every person who has the virus has a 10% chance of spreading the virus to someone else. So I change this to 0.1 for a 10% chance of spreading the virus. And now all of a sudden, after 2 months, we've gone from 1 person being infected to about 250 people being infected. So that's a 10% chance of transmission. Now let's move that up to 30% and see what this does for our numbers. And all of a sudden, we're up to about 5 million people being infected just by changing the probability of someone spreading the virus from about 10% to 30%. It's hugely sensitive on the probability of spread. So let's do a little tweaking with this, that because people know the virus is spreading, they're going to start taking precautions, avoiding places, quarantining cities, that sort of thing. Let's see what sort of effect that has on the spread of the virus. So we're going to keep this 30% is the wild spread of the virus, and we're just going to reduce it by a minuscule amount per day. So I'm going to reduce it by 0.5% per day. So on day 2, on day 1, it's got a 30% chance of spreading. On day 2, it's got a 29.5% chance of spreading. And I'm going to continue that down such that by the end of the 30 days, there is a 0% chance of it spreading. And now all of a sudden, we've gone from infecting 5 million. Yeah, this is the same spread rate. We've gone from infecting 5 million people down to merely about 3,000. And reasons like this is why sensible precautions against virality can have huge effects on the outcome. So here I've got some of the viral spread data. It's always difficult to know whether these reported figures are accurate because, how good are they at diagnosing it at the beginning? Is there over-reporting, under-reporting? There are always significant question marks over how accurate these numbers are. But we're just going to go with it for the moment to get a rough idea of what we're looking at. So this is we're going to call it the actual data. This is going to be my modeling data. So if we put in a spread rate of 50%, then actually let's put our model line in red. Boom. So that's going to be our model data, and this is our actual data. Good. Boom. So this is what a 50% infection rate would look like, and it's actually not a bad fit down here, but it's a terrible fit out here. So we've got to reduce the infection rate, and I'm going to reduce it by, I don't know, 2% a day or something, 0.02. And that it starts to look a little better. Let's go for 0.25. Too much. That was point. There we go. So after a little tweaking, you get something like this. That the smallest number that we have is 580 cases. So we start quite a long way in already. And ballpark figures, you're talking for the early days, it's about a 50% infection rate, which if left unchecked, that's quite a high spread rate. But it's dropping off, the spread rate is dropping off hugely as time has gone on. So the reason the spread rate is slowing, assuming these figures are real, of course, is because people are taking precautions, which naturally limits the spread of this sort of thing. So it's one of those complicated things that if you did nothing, if there genuinely is a transmission rate of about 50%, which is not far off what this starts off at. Let's go up to 55. No, that's too much. And this is what I mean. It's so sensitive to these numbers. Let's go for 52. Yeah, there we go. So, I mean, that would give you a 52% sort of infection rate near the beginning. Left unchecked, you can almost infect the entire planet like that in about 2 months. With sensible precautions, I mean, we're already at about 40,000, but the transmission rate is now, in this sort of region, is now down to about 10%. Again, it's very dangerous to analyze such data with large question marks over it, but unfortunately, it's the best data available. So yeah, I think some sensible precautions were required here, and that's maybe the reason why the infection rates dropped from about 50% down here to about 10% up in this sort of region. Awesome. So why do we have all these viruses in the first place? Well, it's simple. There's a lot of biomatter in people, juicy, tempting biomatter that viruses can use for reproduction. And viruses are versatile little beasties. But viruses are also fragile. So if you've got a viral infection in one person's lungs and it wants to go viral to spread, it's got the rather difficult task of transporting to somebody else's lungs. Now, one of the main vectors here is people cough them out in microscopic little droplets or sneeze or whatever, and if it gets onto their hands, they touch things like door handles and it spreads like that. So incidentally, coughing into your elbow is a really good hint here. It might look a little weird, but it's actually much better for not spreading viruses. Anyway, when those little droplets of water dry out, the virus dies or becomes non-functional. So there's a tendency that these sorts of things transmit better in winter where the temperature is lower and those drops tend to dry out more slowly, versus in summer where they dry out a little quicker. Now sure, this might only be a fraction of a percent per day as the days warm up, but as you've already seen, even with a really simple model like this, a tiny reduction in the spread rate per day is the difference between ending up with a few thousand infected or a few million. Now, not all the factors work in your favor, of course. So just take the worst pandemic of recent history, the 1918 Spanish flu pandemic. That was spread around the world mostly by things like ships. On a fairly slow basis. Now we have mass international rapid air transport, which really does have the potential to enlarge these numbers. But let's just take the 1918 pandemic as a worst case scenario.
Like to date, less than 500 people have died from the coronavirus, and 1,700 people die every day from the flu worldwide, or over 600,000 per year. There's 3,287 deaths in car accidents every day, or 1.2 million per year. And 1.2 million people drown in swimming pools every year.
Yeah, that's the one where I had to pause the video and fact check it. And yeah, it turns out it is bullshit. There aren't 1.2 million people who died drowning in the world, let alone in swimming pools. Yeah, the World Health Organization puts the total number of people who drowned, not just those in swimming pools, at about 300,000. And only a fraction of those who drown will drown in swimming pools.
And 1.2 million people drown in swimming pools every year.
But every single one of these arguments could have been made at the beginning of the 1918 pandemic. Not so much by the end of the year. This is the problem. Viruses have the potential to go viral, which is just not something that is true of choking on peanuts or drowning in swimming pools or dying in a car crash. And just like there are things that you can do to moderate your chances of dying in a car crash, like say for instance putting on a seatbelt, there are things that you can do to reduce the spread of a virus.
Hundreds more Americans are out of the outbreak zone and under quarantine tonight. One group arrived in San Antonio, Texas today, where they will spend 2 weeks under medical observation. Asensio now on the drastic steps being taken to keep the virus from spreading here in the U.S.
Some of them more drastic, like say for instance quarantining a city. Some of them less drastic, like coughing into your elbow. Anyway, like I was saying, taking the 1918 pandemic as a worst case scenario, you're looking at about a third of the world's population getting it. And of those, about 15% died. So in total, about 3 to 6% of the world's population died because of that.
So in America, you get nothing but clickbait headlines about the coronavirus that inflict fear and stress onto you, which is questionably worse for your health than if you were actually infected with the virus.
Which is true, of course, for some people, but probably not true for the people who die from it. And quite a lot of people have died from this. I mean, at the moment, it's about 30-odd thousand infected and about 700 dead. That's about a 2% mortality rate. Smaller, but not crazy smaller than the 1918 pandemic. And of course, those fatalities were mostly clustered around the very old and very young. You know, if you had been around during this pandemic and you were healthy and middle-aged, you would on average about know someone who died from it. About 1 in 100 people of that age bracket would die from this. If you knew a lot of old people or a lot of babies, then yeah, you would have known a significant number of people who died from this. Now, of course, you've got to be a little careful with sort of just averaging these numbers over the whole globe, but that's the sort of ballpark you would be in as a worst case scenario.
The second strain is an actual virus that's far less deadly than the flu, yet incites 300,000 times more fear. It's thought to have originated in Wuhan, China.
Now, there's another problem, that once you get all that viral DNA out there, its chances of you picking up a mutation is basically proportional to the amount of viral DNA out there. Now, those mutations can make it more passive or more aggressive or change the fatality rate. And this is one of the things that happened with the 1918 pandemic, is the second wave had a much higher mortality rate. And through all of this, around the world, it killed about 50 million people. This is just what evolution looks like in action. Nasty viruses tend to burn themselves out by killing too many hosts. And of course, the hosts that are left are more resilient to this sort of thing and survive better. Now, I've got to admit, it's a pretty uncomfortable way of running a planet. By making everyone taller by killing all of the short people, it's uncomfortably unfair. But that's the simple reality of life on Earth. And if you really don't like it, pretty much the only thing that you can do is try to better understand the balance of power between the microorganisms and the macro and its billion-year history, and try to cheat at the game that made us the species we are today. Welcome to the world of science. Awesome. So you might remember me saying how videos go viral is exactly the same as how viruses go viral. So let's see if we can engineer a system. Typically about 100,000 people watch my videos in the first 24 hours. And if everyone who does that shares it with at least 2 people who also watch that video, then it'll get about 300,000 views by the end of day 2 and 700,000 by the end of day 3, which goes on to 12.7 million by the end of the first week and 1.6 billion by the end of week 2, which hopefully will increase people's understanding of the power of virality. So why not just share this video with 2 other people and see what effect it has. I hope you enjoyed that. If you did, remember to hit the notification bell to make sure you don't miss out on new uploads. And if you really like this channel, you can support it directly through Patreon. And I'll leave the links below. And as ever, thanks for watching.